The clink of my fork against the porcelain plate was usually just background noise, a tiny rhythm in our family dinners. But tonight, that small sound echoed like a gunshot in the sudden, heavy silence that had fallen over the dining room. Across from me sat my sister Sarah's daughter, Chloe, her face flushed with teenage defiance and something darker I couldn't quite name. The words she'd just hurled at me hung in the air like poison. "You're just family trash anyway. Nobody here actually wants you around." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, anything. She just stared at her wine glass instead. My brother-in-law, Mark, cleared his throat, but kept quiet. The only other sound was the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking away seconds that felt like hours. I'd actually paid for that clock, a wedding gift 12 years ago. My mother, Eleanor, sat frozen at the head of the table, her napkin clutched in trembling fingers. She opened her mouth twice, then closed it again without speaking. Even my father, Arthur, kept his eyes trained on his half-eaten roast, suddenly fascinated by the pattern of gravy on his plate. The family I'd supported, protected, and frankly, carried for 2 decades couldn't muster a single word in my defense. Standing up felt like moving through water. My legs barely cooperated as I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against hardwood floors I'd helped refinish 3 summers ago. I grabbed my purse from the entry table and walked out the front door, leaving it open behind me. Nobody called after me. Nobody followed. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs I barely registered. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, but I couldn't seem to loosen my grip. 20 minutes later, I pulled into my driveway and sat in the darkness of my garage, engine still running, trying to remember how to breathe normally. My phone buzzed in my purse, probably the family group chat. I ignored it. Inside my house, silence greeted me differently than it had at dinner. This quiet belonged to me, free from judgment and the casual cruelty disguised as family dynamics. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my kitchen counter, staring at nothing in particular. The phone buzzed again, then again. I finally pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The family chat showed 17 new messages. I scrolled through them without really reading, catching fragments of conversation that pretended tonight hadn't happened. Eleanor sharing a recipe. Sarah asking about coordinating schedules for Thanksgiving. Mark posting a meme about football season. Not one mention of the dinner. Not one apology. Not even an acknowledgement that anything had occurred worth discussing. Something inside me shifted. I'd been holding up this family for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to let go. My entire adult life had been spent playing the role of safety net, emergency fund, problem solver, and emotional support system. When had I become so dispensable that a teenager could insult me at the dinner table without consequence? I opened my laptop and started pulling up documents. Bank statements first, then property records, investment accounts, trust documents, legal agreements I'd nearly forgotten about. The list grew longer as I worked through the night, compiling everything that connected me to my family's financial well-being. My hands moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, creating spreadsheets that mapped out every dollar, every asset, every commitment I'd made over the years. The dining room incident played on repeat in my mind. But now it felt different, less painful and more clarifying, like putting on glasses after years of squinting and finally seeing the world in sharp focus. I pulled up the email thread from when Sarah first asked for help with her house. 7 years ago, when her marriage was new and Mark's job seemed promising, but their credit scores told a different story. She'd written 3 paragraphs about wanting to give her future children a stable home, about how temporary the help would be, about paying me back within 2 years maximum. That promise had evaporated somewhere around year 3, morphing into vague assurances that eventually stopped coming altogether. The $68,000 down payment I provided had simply become part of their origin story, conveniently edited to remove my role entirely. I'd heard Sarah tell friends they'd scraped together the money through intense saving, her voice full of pride at their financial discipline. Next came Mark's business loan documents. I'd structured it formally, hired an attorney to draft proper paperwork, set up a payment schedule he'd agreed to enthusiastically. The first 6 months, he'd made payments like clockwork. Then they'd started arriving late. Then they'd stopped completely, replaced by explanations about cash flow issues and promises that next quarter would be different. 18 months ago, he'd stopped mentioning the debt entirely. When I brought it up at a family barbecue, he actually looked confused, as though I was referencing something from ancient history rather than an outstanding balance of $72,000. Sarah had changed the subject quickly, steering conversation toward Chloe's volleyball tournament. The rental property situation with my parents revealed itself as equally one-sided when I examined the actual numbers. They'd been managing the duplex for 5 years, collecting roughly $3,000 monthly in rent from both units. In that entire time, I'd received exactly $0 while continuing to pay property taxes, insurance, and major repairs. Eleanor had explained it once as helping them through Arthur's unexpected early retirement, a temporary arrangement until his pension situation stabilized. That was 5 years ago. His pension had been stable for at least 3 of those years. Yet, the temporary arrangement had solidified into permanent expectation. I found the credit card statements next. The ones from the card I'd added Eleanor to for emergencies. The charges told a story that had nothing to do with actual emergencies. Department store purchases, restaurant meals, salon appointments, gifts for grandchildren, regular discretionary spending that had somehow qualified as urgent enough to warrant using my credit. When I gently mentioned the growing balance last Christmas, Eleanor had looked genuinely hurt, saying she thought I'd wanted to treat her sometimes, that she didn't realize I was keeping track of every little thing. The guilt had worked perfectly. I'd apologized for making her feel bad and never brought it up again. The college fund documentation included notes I'd written to myself when establishing the accounts. My reasoning at the time, giving Chloe and Leo opportunities I'd had to fight for, ensuring they could pursue education without the financial stress I'd experienced. Somewhere in those notes, I'd written that I hoped they'd remember their aunt fondly, that they'd understand the sacrifice represented more than just money. Sitting at my kitchen counter now, the hope felt painfully naive. Chloe didn't know where her college fund came from because nobody had ever told her. To her, it was just something that existed, like air or gravity, requiring no gratitude because she'd never been taught to recognize it as a gift. The vacation cabin had its own folder of documents. I'd purchased it during a strong financial year, thinking it would be nice to have a family retreat space. Sarah had immediately started planning trips there, decorating it with her aesthetic, establishing traditions with her kids. Within 6 months, it had become their cabin in every conversation, the place where they went to unwind and reconnect. I'd been invited exactly 3 times in 4 years. Each visit felt like being a guest in a property I owned, careful not to disrupt the systems Sarah had established, apologizing for taking up space in my own vacation home. The last time I'd suggested using it for a weekend, Sarah had sighed heavily and explained they'd already planned a trip. Could I possibly pick different dates? I picked different dates, then canceled my plans entirely when those dates also didn't work for her schedule. My eyes burned from screen fatigue, but I kept working, needing to see the complete picture before I could decide what to do with it. Each document represented a moment when I'd chosen family over self-protection, generosity over boundaries, relationship maintenance over self-respect. The numbers told a story I'd never bothered to add up before. Sarah's house, purchased with a down payment I'd provided after her credit fell apart 7 years ago. The title listed me as co-owner, something we'd agreed to for tax purposes she'd never quite explained. Mark's business venture, funded almost entirely by a loan from me that had never been repaid, using my commercial property as collateral he'd sworn was temporary. My parents' retirement, supplemented by the rental income from the duplex I owned, but let them manage, keeping all the profits while I covered maintenance and property taxes. The college fund I'd established for Chloe and her younger brother Leo, now sitting at just over $90,000, ready for their futures. The vacation cabin in Lake Arrowhead, deed in my name, but used exclusively by Sarah's family for the past 4 years. My car, which Mark borrowed twice a week for client meetings because it looked more professional than his 10-year-old sedan. The credit card I'd added Eleanor to 5 years ago for emergencies, currently carrying a balance of $14,000 for purchases that had nothing to do with actual emergencies. I hadn't realized I'd been financing their entire lifestyle until I saw it laid out in spreadsheets and statements. They'd needed help once during genuinely difficult times, and I'd offered it freely. Somehow, that temporary assistance had evolved into permanent dependence they'd stopped acknowledging as anything but their due. Dawn broke before I finished cataloging everything. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway, too focused to bother making a fresh pot. The final tally made me feel sick. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. I'd been treated like an ATM, valued only for what I could provide while being disrespected in ways I'd never have tolerated from strangers. My phone buzzed with a morning wave of family chat messages. Arthur asking if anyone wanted to grab breakfast. Sarah sharing photos from Chloe's volleyball game. Eleanor posting a prayer request for someone's cousin I'd never met. The mundane continued as if I existed only in the periphery of their lives, noticed solely when they needed something. I typed out a message in the chat, then deleted it. Wrote another, deleted that too. What I wanted to say couldn't fit in a text message. The anger I felt demanded more than digital words on a screen. Instead, I opened my email and started drafting letters. One to my attorney, David. Another to my financial advisor, Emily. A third to the property management company handling my rental properties. Each message outlined specific instructions for immediate action. By noon, I'd set everything in motion. Bank accounts would be frozen by end of business. Property transfers would begin processing within the standard timeframes. Loan repayments would be formally demanded. College funds would be dissolved and redistributed to charities I'd carefully selected. Every financial thread connecting me to my family would be severed cleanly and completely. My attorney called within an hour of receiving my email. David had handled my affairs for the past decade and knew my family situation better than most. I want to make absolutely sure you've thought this through, he said, his voice careful. These actions are legal and within your rights, but they're also pretty much irreversible. Once you pull this support, rebuilding those relationships will be extremely difficult. What relationships? The question came out harder than I'd intended. I'm furniture to them, David. Useful furniture they'd notice only if it disappeared. He sighed on the other end of the line. I've witnessed how they treat you at family events. Can't say I disagree with your assessment. I'll have the paperwork ready by this afternoon. You'll need to sign everything before we file. I'll be there at 3. The rest of the day passed in a strange state of calm determination. I showered, dressed in my most professional outfit, and handled the business of dismantling my family's financial foundation with the same efficiency I applied to my work as a senior project manager. Emotions could wait. Right now, I needed to be practical. At David's office, I signed document after document. Notices of loan default, property transfer initiations, formal dissolution of co-ownership agreements, revocation of credit card authorizations. Each signature felt like cutting another rope that had been holding me down. David's office smelled like old books and furniture polish, a scent that somehow made everything feel more official. His assistant brought in coffee I didn't drink, letting it grow cold on the mahogany desk while I worked through the stack of papers requiring my signature. This section addresses the co-ownership dissolution, David explained, pointing to a particularly dense paragraph of legal language. Since you provided the entire down payment, and Sarah has no equity stake beyond appreciation, you're within full rights to demand either buyout or sale. Given their financial situation, buyout seems unlikely. I initialed the margin, my pen scratching against expensive paper. He continued through each document, explaining implications I mostly understood, but appreciated hearing confirmed by legal expertise. The rental property termination would require 60 days' notice to my parents, standard for property management situations. Mark's loan default triggered immediate repayment demands with interest that had been accruing since his payments stopped. The business collateral situation is interesting, David noted, adjusting his reading glasses. Mark used your commercial property as collateral for additional loans he took from other sources. When you reclaim that property, those loans become his problem to secure differently. His creditors won't be happy. That's not my concern anymore. No, it's not, he agreed. Though it will likely accelerate his business collapse. Without that collateral backing, most institutions will call their loans immediately. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt at that. Mark's business struggles would affect Sarah and the kids, creating ripple effects I couldn't entirely control. But I reminded myself that Mark had made choices. Taking additional loans, leveraging assets that weren't his, building a house of cards that required my foundation to stand. His collapse would have come eventually. I was just removing my role as the perpetual safety net that had been delaying the inevitable. The college fund concerns me a bit, David mentioned as I initialed the final page of that particular document. The kids didn't insult you. Are you sure you want to include them in this? The question deserved a thoughtful answer, not a reactive one. I sat down the pen and considered it properly. Chloe is 16 and Leo is 12, I said slowly. They're old enough to be learning how relationships work, how people should treat each other. Right now, they're learning that family members can be disrespected without consequence as long as they're useful. That generosity should be expected rather than appreciated. That saying cruel things carries no real weight. David listened without interrupting. If I leave their college fund intact while removing everything else, what does that teach them? That attacking me is fine because I'll still provide for them anyway. That they're exempt from the consequences of family dysfunction because they're young. I shook my head. Leo might be too young to fully understand, and that hurts. But Chloe participated directly in what happened. She said the words. Her parents' silence taught her those words were acceptable. So, the fund dissolution is educational. It's reality, I corrected. Actions have consequences. Families don't owe you anything just because you exist. Opportunities need to be valued, not assumed. Maybe learning that at 16 and 12 serves them better than learning it at 25 or 30 when the stakes are higher. I sat down the pen and looked at him directly. Chloe called me trash at dinner last night. Her parents said nothing. My parents said nothing. Those kids are learning that treating people poorly comes without consequences as long as the victim is convenient to have around. Maybe learning that actions have real-world outcomes will serve them better than a college fund they assume will always be there. David nodded slowly. Fair enough. That covers everything then. I'll begin filing tomorrow morning. These processes take time. Legal notices require proper service, which typically takes 3 to 5 business days minimum. You should expect contact from your family within a week once they start receiving official notices. I won't be responding. Probably wise for your mental health. Let me handle all communication through proper legal channels. We shook hands, his grip firm and professional. Walking out of his office building into late afternoon sunshine, I felt the weight of what I'd set in motion. No going back now. The legal machinery would grind forward regardless of second thoughts, or family tears or desperate appeals. My car sat in the parking garage, and I stood beside it for several minutes before getting in, just breathing, letting reality settle into my bones. Somewhere across town, my family was going about their normal routines, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Within the week, notices would start arriving. By the following weekend, their world would be upended. The explanation that this was years in the making, that the dinner was merely the final straw, wouldn't compute for people who genuinely stopped seeing me as anything beyond a resource. I drove home slowly, taking the long route, watching the city transition from business district to residential neighborhoods. People everywhere living their lives, completely disconnected from the personal earthquake I just triggered. The world was so much bigger than family drama. Yet, family drama could still feel like the entire world when you were in the middle of it. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and sat in my backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in gradually darkening shades. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, deliberately left inside, giving me a few more hours of peace before the coming week's chaos began. I'd left David's office feeling lighter than I had in years. The sun was setting as I drove home, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful for how I felt inside. Beautiful but distant, like watching something through glass. My phone had been buzzing periodically all afternoon, but I'd left it in my purse ignored. Now, sitting in my driveway, I finally pulled it out and opened the family chat. 23 new messages. Still nothing about last night. Sarah had shared a funny video. Eleanor posted about her book club meeting. Arthur made a joke about his golf game. Mark asked if anyone wanted to grab dinner on Saturday. Chloe shared a selfie with her friends, all of them making duck faces at the camera. They'd moved on as if nothing had happened because to them, nothing had happened. A daughter, sister, aunt had been insulted and humiliated at a family dinner, and the incident had already evaporated from their collective memory. Or maybe it had never registered as significant enough to remember in the first place. I scrolled to the bottom of the chat and typed out a single sentence. Everything in my name disappears tomorrow. Then I turned off my phone completely and went inside. Sleep came surprisingly easy that night. I'd expected to lie awake, second-guessing my decisions, but instead I fell into the deepest rest I'd had in months. No anxiety dreams about family obligations I couldn't meet. No stress nightmares about financial challenges I'd need to solve. Just darkness and peace. The next few days passed in a strange state of calm before the storm. I went to work, attended meetings, responded to emails, maintained my normal routine, while knowing that legal machinery was grinding forward in the background. David sent me updates confirming various filings had been submitted, each message marking another step toward complete separation. My alarm went off on the fifth morning after signing the documents. I made coffee, scrambled eggs, and actually tasted my breakfast for the first time in recent memory. The morning news played on the television, a comfortable backdrop of information I only half listened to while planning my day. I deliberately kept my phone off since leaving David's office, needing the mental space to process what I'd done without immediate family reaction. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, I knew the grace period had ended. Legal notices would have been served by now. The responses would be waiting. I turned on my phone at 9. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications that made my email app display an error message about storage limits. Text messages numbered in the hundreds. Missed calls showed 92 attempts. The family chat had exploded with over 300 messages. I opened the chat first, curiosity getting the better of me. The messages started the evening after I'd left David's office. Normal family chat activity at first. Eleanor sharing a recipe. Sarah posting about Chloe's activities. Mark making jokes. Then, 3 days later, everything changed. Sarah had sent the first crisis message at 10:23 p.m. Did anyone else get a weird legal notice in the mail today? Followed by, it's about the house. Something about co-ownership dissolution. The messages escalated from there. Eleanor asking if I'd sent something, too, her texts growing increasingly confused as she tried to understand the rental property termination notice. Arthur demanding someone explain what was happening. Mark suddenly very interested in talking to me after days of silence. By the fourth day, they'd apparently all compared notes and realized the scope of what was unfolding. The family chat transformed into crisis management mode. At 11:47 p.m. that night, Sarah had written, "She's doing this deliberately. Everything we have is connected to her somehow." Followed by, "Someone needs to call her now." Then, "This isn't funny. She can't actually do this. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Why would she send us these papers?" The messages continued through that night and into the next morning, each family member gradually understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding or administrative error. This was intentional, comprehensive, and legal. At 1:34 a.m. on the fifth day, Sarah had written, "The bank called. They're moving forward with foreclosure proceedings unless we can buy her out. We don't have that kind of money." That's when the begging started. "Eleanor, please call me. Your father and I need to talk to you about the rental situation. There must be some misunderstanding. Sarah, you can't do this. We have kids. You're seriously going to make your niece and nephew homeless over a stupid argument. Mark, this is completely unreasonable. I have business obligations that depend on that property. You're sabotaging my entire career. Arthur, your mother is crying. You need to stop this nonsense and act like an adult." The messages continued through the night, each one more frantic than the last. By the morning of the fifth day, they'd apparently started receiving additional notices from various institutions. The college fund dissolution, credit card revocation, loan default proceedings. Each new revelation prompted another wave of texts ranging from angry to pleading to accusatory. Chloe had even chimed in at 8:15 a.m. "My mom is freaking out. What is happening? Did I do something wrong?" I read through hundreds of messages with a detached sense of observation, like watching a documentary about someone else's family crisis. They'd notice my absence now. The furniture had vanished, and suddenly they couldn't function without it. My personal text messages were worse. Sarah had sent 47 texts overnight, evolving from demanding answers to making promises about family therapy to outright begging. Eleanor had called 23 times, leaving voicemails I couldn't bring myself to listen to yet. Even Arthur, who rarely texted, had sent a dozen messages that started authoritative and ended almost apologetic. I poured another cup of coffee and started going through my personal emails instead. David had sent a summary of all filings submitted that morning, confirming everything had processed as planned. Emily had moved my investment accounts to new institutions my family couldn't access. The property management company confirmed they'd terminated my parents' arrangement and listed the duplex for sale. A knock at my door interrupted my reading. Through the peephole, I saw Sarah standing on my porch, looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, mascara smudged under her eyes, still wearing what appeared to be pajama pants under a hastily thrown-on jacket. I opened the door, but didn't invite her inside. "What is wrong with you?" Sarah's voice cracked on the last word. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on our house. They say you initiated something to remove yourself from the deed and called in the down payment as a loan default. We could lose everything." "You will lose everything," I corrected quietly. "That's the point." "Over what?" Chloe said. "She's 16. Teenagers say horrible things when they're moody. You're really going to destroy your family because a kid had an attitude." Chloe didn't destroy anything. She just said out loud what all of you clearly think. I leaned against the door frame, keeping my voice level. What destroyed things was every single person at that table staying silent. You, Mark, Eleanor, Arthur. Nobody said a word. Nobody told her she was out of line. You all just sat there and let her call me trash like it was a reasonable assessment. Sarah's face flushed. We were shocked. We didn't know how to respond in the moment. That doesn't mean we agreed with her. Your silence meant exactly that. I crossed my arms. But this isn't really about one dinner, Sarah. That was just the moment I finally understood what I've been to this family for years. An ATM. A safety net you take for granted. Someone whose feelings don't matter as long as the money keeps flowing. That's not true. Tears started streaming down her face now. You're my sister. We love you. You love what I provide. There's a difference. I glanced past her to where Mark sat in their car, watching us from the driveway. When's the last time any of you asked how I was doing? Not as a prelude to requesting something, just because you actually cared about my life. Sarah opened her mouth then closed it again. She couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. I've been funding your lifestyle for 7 years, I continued. Your house, Mark's business, the kids' activities, your vacations. I covered Eleanor and Arthur's retirement shortfall. I gave Chloe and Leo a college fund worth more than most people earn in 2 years. And somehow I became so invisible in the process that you couldn't even defend me for 30 seconds at a family dinner. So, you're going to take everything away? Just like that. Sarah's tears had turned to anger now. You're going to put us on the street to prove some petty point. There's nothing petty about self-respect. I straightened up, preparing to close the door. You have 60 days before foreclosure proceedings actually begin. That's more time than you gave me before deciding I wasn't worth defending. I suggest you use it wisely. Eleanor and Arthur are terrified, Sarah said desperately. They can't afford to lose that rental income. You're hurting them, too, and they didn't do anything except stay quiet for a few seconds. They did worse than stay quiet. They sat at the head of that table and allowed their granddaughter to verbally abuse their daughter in their home. Then they participated in a group chat the next day like it never happened. They made their choice. I started to close the door, but Sarah jammed her foot in the gap. Please, her voice broke completely now. We'll apologize. All of us. Chloe too. We'll make it right. Just please don't do this. You had that opportunity last night. You had it this morning in the group chat. You had it every time you treated me like my only value was financial. You never took those opportunities, so I'm taking mine now. I gently but firmly removed her foot and closed the door, locking it behind me. Through the window, I watched Sarah stand on my porch for another minute before finally walking back to her car. She and Mark sat there for nearly 10 minutes, having what appeared to be an intense conversation before finally driving away. The rest of the day brought more visitors. Eleanor and Arthur arrived around noon. Arthur's face red with anger while Eleanor looked genuinely distraught. I didn't answer the door. They rang the bell 14 times before giving up and leaving a note that I threw away unread. Mark came back alone in the evening, his approach more calculated than Sarah's emotional plea. He tried to negotiate through the door, treating it like a business transaction that could be resolved with the right terms. When I didn't respond, he resorted to threats about legal action that we both knew had no basis in reality. The family chat had evolved into an ongoing crisis management session I observed like a spectator. They created a separate group without me, but Sarah kept screenshotting their conversations and sending them in desperate attempts to make me feel guilty about their panic. The screenshots revealed more than Sarah probably intended. In their private chat, the tone shifted from the public-facing politeness they tried to maintain in messages directed at me. Arthur called me vindictive and ungrateful. Eleanor worried more about what extended family would think than about repairing our relationship. Mark strategized about legal loopholes that might force me to reverse decisions that were entirely within my rights. Only Leo seemed genuinely sad rather than angry, asking his parents why Aunt was doing this, whether he'd done something wrong. That message, screenshotted and sent by Sarah as emotional ammunition, hit harder than she probably realized. Not because it made me want to reverse course, but because it showed how completely they'd failed to explain to their children the basic dynamics of respect and reciprocity. They contacted extended family members, painting me as unstable and vindictive. My Aunt Brenda called 3 times, leaving messages about Christian forgiveness and family obligations. Her voicemails quoted scripture about honoring parents and loving thy neighbor, conveniently ignoring any verses about treating people with basic dignity. The third message included a lengthy story about her own sister, who'd apparently had some conflict 20 years ago that Brenda was convinced paralleled my situation. She regretted it until the day she died, Brenda warned ominously, as though my choices were guaranteed to lead to deathbed remorse rather than relief. Cousin Lisa sent a long email about how disappointed my late grandma Dorothy would be in my behavior. The email was 3 pages long, single-spaced, detailing every family gathering where Grandma had emphasized the importance of family unity. Lisa conveniently forgot that Grandma had also emphasized treating people with respect, that she'd been the first person to call out bad behavior regardless of who was acting out. Grandma would have been disappointed, but probably not in me. She'd once told me that being family didn't excuse being cruel, that blood relation was a starting point, not an excuse for bad treatment. She'd cut off her own brother for 15 years after he'd made disparaging comments about her husband. Family unity mattered to Grandma, but not more than self-respect. My Uncle Richard texted that I was being selfish and immature. That real adults work through their problems instead of running away. This from a man who hadn't spoken to his own son in 6 years over a political disagreement. His advice on family reconciliation rang hollow given his own track record. What struck me most was how quickly extended family mobilized based entirely on one side of the story. None of them had asked what happened. None had requested my perspective. They'd simply accepted the narrative that I'd inexplicably destroyed the family over nothing, that I was having some kind of breakdown that required intervention. The speed of their judgment revealed something important about family dynamics in general. People sided with whoever told the story first, whoever seemed most distressed, whoever could paint themselves most convincingly as the victim. Truth became secondary to narrative performance. None of them had witnessed the dinner. None of them knew the years of one-sided support that had led to this moment. They only knew the version my parents and Sarah had presented. And that version cast me as the villain in a story where I'd actually been the victim for years. I blocked most of them. The ones I didn't block, I responded to with a simple message. Ask them what happened at dinner last Wednesday. Ask them what was said and who defended me. Then reassess your judgment. None of them followed up after that. Either they'd asked and learned something that complicated their initial judgment, or they decided staying out of it entirely was easier than acknowledging they'd rushed to condemn me without facts. Either way, the messages stopped. The silence from extended family felt like its own kind of loss. These were people I'd grown up with, celebrated holidays alongside, considered part of my support system. Their willingness to write me off based on incomplete information from obviously biased sources showed how shallow some of those relationships had actually been. True connection couldn't be severed that easily. The fact that a few text messages could end decades of family relationship meant those relationships hadn't been particularly deep to begin with. Disappointing, but clarifying. My friend Laura from work called that evening, having somehow heard through the grapevine that something was happening with my family. Unlike my relatives, she asked what was going on rather than assuming she already knew. I heard your sister is telling people you had a breakdown, Laura said carefully. That doesn't sound like you, so I figured I'd check in directly. I gave her the abbreviated version. The dinner, the silence, the years of financial support, the decision to stop being their safety net. Good for you, she said immediately. I've watched you cancel plans for the last 5 years to deal with family emergencies that never seemed like actual emergencies. Your sister calls, you drop everything. Your mom needs something, you rearrange your entire schedule. When was the last time any of them did that for you? I couldn't remember a single instance. Exactly, Laura continued. That's not family. That's exploitation with a relationship label attached. You're not having a breakdown. You're having a breakthrough. Her support meant more than she probably realized. After hours of messages from family members condemning my choices, having someone understand why I'd made them felt like oxygen after holding my breath underwater. We talked for over an hour, Laura sharing her own experiences with family boundary setting, the guilt that came with it, the ultimate relief when she'd stopped trying to maintain relationships that only drained her. Her perspective helped settle something anxious in my chest, reminded me that what felt radical and harsh to my family might actually be reasonable and necessary from an outside view. They'll either learn from this or they won't, Laura said before we hung up. But either way, you'll be free from the constant management of their chaos. That's worth more than their approval. David called that evening to report that Sarah had contacted his office demanding to speak with me. She seems to think this can be negotiated. I told her all communication needs to go through me, and that your position is final. She didn't take it well. I imagine not. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. I've seen too many families take advantage of the generous members until there's nothing left to take. Setting boundaries, even severe ones, is sometimes the only language people understand. It doesn't feel right, I admitted. It feels terrible, actually. But I couldn't keep living as their backup plan while being treated as disposable. That's the difference between you and them. You actually feel remorse for protecting yourself. They feel entitled to your continued support despite their treatment of you. The following weeks established a new pattern. Legal proceedings moved forward on schedule. Sarah and Mark scrambled to refinance their house, but their credit situation made it nearly impossible. They'd been living beyond their means, propped up by my financial backing, and banks weren't interested in taking that risk. Eleanor and Arthur listed their main house, hoping to downsize and survive on the proceeds, plus Social Security. The duplex I'd owned took about 3 months to sell, eventually going to an investor who planned to renovate both units. The sale netted me a decent profit that I donated to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Mark's business imploded without access to the commercial property he'd been using rent-free. He tried to blame me publicly, but most of his professional contacts knew the real story by then. Word spreads quickly in business communities when someone's been operating on borrowed legitimacy. The college fund dissolution hurt me more than I'd expected. I genuinely wanted Chloe and Leo to have opportunities I'd worked hard to provide. But David had been right that keeping it would have taught the wrong lesson. Instead, I split the money between 3 educational charities serving underprivileged youth who'd probably appreciate it more than kids who'd been raised to expect support without gratitude. Chloe sent me one text about 6 weeks after everything began. I'm sorry for what I said. I was just mad about something else and took it out on you. I didn't mean it. Too little, too late, and still somehow my fault for being a convenient target. I didn't respond. Leo, who was only 12 and probably didn't fully understand what had happened, sent a message asking if I was still his aunt. That one broke my heart. I responded that I loved him, but the adults in his life needed to learn some important lessons about treating people with respect. I hoped he'd understand someday. The family chat eventually went quiet. After weeks of crisis mode, they'd apparently run out of energy to maintain the group dynamic that had excluded me even when I was technically included. The messages petered out, and the chat died a natural death. Individual family members made occasional attempts to reach out, usually when they encountered new financial obstacles that reminded them of what I'd been providing. Each time, I maintained my boundary. The furniture would not be returning to their lives. 6 months later, I ran into Sarah at a grocery store. She looked older, worn down by stress, and probably working more hours than she was used to. They'd managed to keep the house somehow, though I suspected they'd borrowed money from Mark's parents to make it happen. We made eye contact across the produce section. She hesitated, clearly deciding whether to approach. I gave her a small nod of acknowledgement and continued shopping. She didn't follow. That brief moment crystallized something important for me. I didn't feel triumphant about their struggles. I didn't feel vindicated by their scrambling to rebuild what they'd taken for granted. I just felt free from the obligation to fix problems that had never really been mine to solve. My life had improved dramatically in their absence. Without the constant drain of family obligations, I had time and resources for things I'd been postponing for years. I started taking piano lessons, something I'd wanted to do since childhood. Joined a hiking group that explored trails every weekend. Even began dating someone I'd met through work, A relationship that might not have had space to develop when my emotional energy was consumed by family management. Friends I'd neglected while prioritizing family needs welcomed me back into their lives. They'd noticed my absence. They told me how I'd gradually withdrawn into family obligations that seemed to take more than they gave. Having me back felt like recovering someone they'd lost. The money I'd been funneling to family members now funded a life I actually enjoyed living. A kitchen renovation I'd been postponing. A trip to Ireland I'd always dreamed about. Investment in hobbies that brought genuine joy instead of obligation. I wasn't lonely without them. That realization surprised me most of all. I'd feared that cutting family ties would leave me isolated, but instead it created space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. My parents made one final attempt at reconciliation around the holidays. Eleanor sent a handwritten letter, her penmanship shaky with age or emotion, asking if we could start fresh. She acknowledged that they'd failed me, that she should have spoken up at dinner, that she'd been taking my support for granted. The apology felt genuine, and I appreciated that. But it also felt too late. Not because I couldn't forgive, but because I'd realized I didn't want to return to being the person I'd been in that family dynamic. The version of me who'd accepted being called trash without defense deserved better than the life I'd been living. I wrote back, keeping it brief. I told her I appreciated the apology, but needed to maintain distance for my own well-being. I wished her and Arthur the best, but wouldn't be resuming financial support or regular contact. The boundary was necessary, not negotiable. She never responded, and I didn't expect her to. Chloe graduated high school through some combination of scholarships, part-time work, and probably loans I'd never know about. I saw the announcement on social media through a mutual connection 3 years after that fateful dinner. She looked happy in her cap and gown, surrounded by family who'd apparently figured out how to support her without my checkbook. Good. For her, I thought genuinely. Maybe the struggle had taught her something valuable about gratitude and working for what you want. Maybe not. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. Mark's business never recovered, but he found employment with a competitor, taking a position several levels below where he'd been operating independently. Sarah worked full-time now, something she'd avoided when my money made it unnecessary. They downsized their lifestyle significantly, sold the vacation cabin in Lake Arrowhead, and lived more modestly than the image they'd been projecting. Part of me felt bad about that. Most of me recognized it as the natural consequence of living beyond your means on someone else's generosity. 2 years after that dinner, I was genuinely happy. Not because my family was struggling, but because I discovered what life could be when I prioritized my own well-being instead of everyone else's comfort. The anger had faded, replaced by a calm certainty that I'd made the right choice. Would I have preferred a family that valued me enough to defend me? Absolutely. Would I go back to being their financial safety net in exchange for superficial connection? Never again. Sometimes people ask if I regret it, cutting off my entire family over one incident. I remind them it wasn't one incident. It was one final moment of clarity after years of being undervalued and taken for granted. The dinner simply made visible what had been true all along. I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret demanding basic respect as a condition of relationship. I don't regret choosing my own peace over their convenience. If that makes me family trash in their eyes, so be it. At least now I'm trash that knows its worth. The hardest part wasn't leaving them behind. It was accepting that I'd stayed too long in the first place, accepting treatment I'd never have tolerated from anyone else simply because we shared DNA. Family should mean something more than obligatory financial support in exchange for being tolerated. I built a new life, one where people valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Friends who checked on me because they cared, not because they needed something. Relationships with actual reciprocity instead of one-sided giving disguised as love. My career flourished without the constant distraction of family crisis requiring my attention and resources. The promotion I'd been working toward finally came through. Partially because I could actually focus on my work instead of managing everyone else's emergencies. 3 years later, I received an invitation to Leo's high school graduation. Just a card in the mail, no note attached. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide what it meant. An olive branch, a formality, a genuine desire for my presence. I didn't attend, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Opening that door even slightly would invite expectations I no longer wanted to meet. Leo deserved family members who showed up consistently, not an aunt who'd need to maintain firm boundaries to protect her own peace. I sent a card with a check for $100, a fraction of what the college fund would have provided, but something meaningful nonetheless. A gesture that acknowledged our connection without rebuilding bridges I'd deliberately burned. The family trash had found her own family, one she'd chosen and cultivated with care. One that would never let anyone call her names at dinner without consequence. One that understood the difference between love and exploitation. And honestly, that family suited me much better than the one I'd been born into. Have you ever had to choose your peace over family obligation?